This is Dr. Lee from Brandman University, and I'm going to share with you a little bit about data collection and qualitative research. Throughout this presentation, I'll share some best practices and some suggestions on how you can better collect your data for your study. In qualitative research, we work with three different types of data, and today I'm going to walk you through some examples and share with you some best practices related to each of these three types. And so we'll begin by talking about interviews. In interviews, there are typically two types of interviews, the first being focus groups and the second being individual interviews. Focus groups are done where groups of people are interviewed together, and the advantages of doing a focus group interview is that it's typically lower anxiety because it's a group setting and no one person is put on the spot. And so I find that by doing focus groups, I sometimes get more responses and it's more likely that respondents who might be shy are going to volunteer more answers in the group setting. Individual interviews can be broken down into two different types. The first is what's known as a structured interview. And this is where there are structured questions. Typically, questions are written before the interview and covers the content the researcher wants to cover in some way. The unstructured approach is when answers lead to more questions and the questions are not scripted ahead of time. And so if you are to do individual interviews, you first have to decide if you want to take the structured approach or the unstructured approach. And I would say for any of the two types, focus groups or interviews, there is always room for follow-up interview questions during the interview. And then once the interview is over, and once you had a chance to review your data, there's also opportunities to do what are called follow-up interviews based on the initial interview experience. So those are just a couple of approaches to doing interviews. And so next we want to look at what makes a good interview question. So a good interview question uses language that is mutually understandable. So this is where the researcher and those that are being interviewed are sharing a knowledge base, a common base in terms of these terms. So when you get to the technical terms, you may need to clarify some of the key terms so that there's common ground, so that there's a mutual understanding of what those terms mean. Next, a good interview question. It's always good to have a scripted interview questions first, but adapt the questions on the day of the interview. And what I'm getting at here is on the day of the interview, you don't need to read the questions from a script. You can adapt and talk through them. This is very unlike an interview for a job where questions have to be scripted from one interviewee to the next. Remember, the goal of qualitative research is to retell the stories from the field. And so your goal in this case is to tease out those good stories, and it's always better to have a conversation about it and let the questions happen naturally. Okay, so on the day of the interview, you already have practiced using these questions, so let the questions come naturally and try not to read it from the script. Keep the questions simple, and remember, a good question is one that teases out those good stories. So get the respondents thinking about their experiences and invite them to share their experiences. That's really important. You may need to ask follow-up questions during the interview. That's okay. That's acceptable. But what is not acceptable is leading the respondent. So leading the respondent is forecasting an answer, imposing an answer on them. So just tread that ethical line between what is ethical and not ethical, and ask open-ended follow-up questions and try not to lead the respondent during the follow-up questions. And I would say it's also very important to make personal connections with the respondents and engage in a dialogue. So again, this is not like a job interview. Okay, so here are some sample interview questions. First, creating a safe learning environment is a critical step in beginning a lesson. Tell me how you create a safe learning environment in your class. And you can see this is very open-ended and it engages in storytelling. It allows a teacher to tell his or her story of how they create a safe learning environment in the classroom. The next example, effective leaders engage in dialogue with stakeholders before making key decisions. What are some ways you engage in dialogue with those that you lead? So what are some ways you engage in dialogue? Again, teases out stories and allows the respondent to share several stories related to the topic of engaging with stakeholders. The third example here says there are many external pressures that impact how a leader plans for the future of an organization. What are some external pressures you face and how do you work with these pressures? And again, very open-ended. It fosters storytelling. It allows the respondent to run with it and literally tell several stories about external pressures that he or she faces. I'm going to spend a few minutes and talk you through how to prepare for these interviews. Because these interviews are spontaneous and interactive, you want to make sure you record the interview. And my suggestion is to record it with an audio device. And notice here on the left hand, the left picture, there's a picture of a recording, a digital recorder. So this is a very worthwhile investment for any researcher. They probably run about $25, $30 at your local technology store. Um, and you can also use an app on your smartphone, okay? But my recommendation is that you always have a backup recording device so you're not just relying on one. And so the story I want to share here is I had a doctoral student doing data collection for his dissertation. He did not have a backup device and he only used the app on his phone. And after about an hour's worth of conversation, he got back to his car and he did what any good researcher would do, which is to listen to the recording right away and to take notes and to review what was said. And he realized that his phone was out of memory and only recorded the first about a minute and a half of the interview, and then it stopped. And he was devastated because he didn't have a backup device. And so when I asked him, what exactly happened with your phone, he says, well, Dr. Lee, I hate to admit it, but I had too many apps and I had taken too many selfies the day before. And so the memory was full and he ran out of memory very quickly. So if you're using an app, you just want to make sure you have ample memory, but also to have a backup device. And I actually would prefer the iPhone app as a backup device and use the recorder as a primary device. Um, so while you're interviewing and these two devices are recording, you may want to take some notes during the interview, but try not to let the note taking interrupt the flow of the interview. So what I do is I have my notebook out and I'm just jotting down some follow-up questions, and not entire questions, but just phrases and words. And really, these are notes that are only understandable by me and nobody else in the world, really. But these are important notes for me to take so I can be reminded of something later. So a notepad is helpful. If you have a good memory, which I don't have a good memory, then you could probably remember a lot of these things. But there may be a need to take some notes during the interview. Okay. All right. So next we're going to move on to observations. And observations is a second type of data collection in qualitative research. And so here are some best practices I want to share with you. So when you're planning for your observation, start by reviewing your original research question. And you need to identify an appropriate setting to observe and consider what you might see as an answer to your research question. So in other words, picking the right setting is really important, because if you pick the right setting, then what you observe will ultimately help answer that research question. It'll circle back to that research question. Um, And so when you're observing, you're going to do what you're going to take what are called field notes, which is literally opening up a notebook and taking notes and writing down what you observe. But when you're taking field notes, just make sure that you're also using the highest level of ethical considerations when you're taking those notes. So, what is acceptable is you using your professional opinion. What is not acceptable is you assuming or inferring things that might be happening. Okay, so just again, make sure you're an ethical researcher and not letting your bias or your opinion taint the data. But on the other hand, it is absolutely okay to exercise your professional opinion. So students often ask me, what do you mean by that? Can you give me an example? So here's an example. If I am a principal doing a study on teaching, and the goal is to observe good teaching, and let's say, for example, I'm observing a teacher create a safe learning environment, right? And I consider that good teaching, so I'm going to write that down in my field notes, and I might say something like the teacher is creating a safe classroom environment by making sure that all kids are engaged and making sure that the language used is age appropriate. So I'm writing down things that I would consider a good teaching. However, okay, here's where assumptions and inferences happen, and it's not okay. If a teacher is not doing those things, then what is not acceptable is for me to write down in my field notes, this teacher did not have eye-to-eye contact with every student, so therefore she is not a good teacher because she's not engaging all students in learning. Okay, so there can be assumptions and inferences made. However, on the other hand, on the other side of it is really you are allowed to use your professional opinion as you're taking field notes. Okay, so field notes are taken handwritten in notebooks, and then what you do later is to take your field notes and type them up in a Word doc. Next, we're going to look at the third type of data, which is artifacts. And artifacts can be anything that's already in print form. It could be something like a journal entry, it could be meeting minutes, it could be documents from a workshop. So anything that's in print form can be considered an artifact. Okay, and so again, we want to start by looking at the original research question. And here you want to identify some documents that can help answer that original research question. Okay, and so then these artifacts can be coded because it's already in Word form. Sometimes you can scan or convert them to PDFs or Microsoft Word. And so sometimes students ask, well, can you give me an example of a good artifact? So here's one. If the research is looking at what are the students' experiences when going to get tutoring services at the university, appropriate artifacts might be something like the student's journal entry, where they reflect on their experience in the tutoring session. Okay. It could also be like the evaluation at the end of a tutoring session where the students can evaluate how good the tutoring session was. Or it could even be something like an email sent from the student to the tutor thanking them for helping them with the homework assignment. Okay, so those are examples of artifacts that directly evidence the student's experience with the tutoring session. Okay, so again, we want to circle back to the research question and ask ourselves, what artifacts can help us answer this original research question? So let's talk a little bit about equipment. So I shared with you some audio recording equipment, but for field notes, for taking notes, and also for taking notes during the interview, I recommend just having one entire notebook dedicated to each study. And I like the moleskin notebooks because they have, it's very durable, heavy weighted paper. The binding is very strong. There's that little rubber band that can hold it all together. And there are sleeves inside where you can put people's business cards. And so I really like the moleskin notebooks. You can get them at Barnes& Noble. You can get them online. But do consider getting a notebook dedicated just to a particular study that you're doing. Okay. Um, we're getting close to the end, and so what I want to talk about next is this idea that when all three different types of data work together, it speaks to this skill called triangulation of data. And what that does is by triangulating the data, um, you have better reliability within the data that you're collecting. So what is triangulation? Triangulation is the use of multiple methods or data sources in qualitative research to develop a comprehensive understanding of a phenomenon. So by triangulating your data, you're making sure that the data is high quality and there's credibility behind the stories that are being told. And a lot of this discussion can be handled in the validity and reliability section of your dissertation, and specifically internal reliability of data is how you would approach that. Okay. I want to share with you a few examples about triangulation. And so, although researchers try to get all three types of data, sometimes it's just not possible. Okay. So, the first example is a study that I recently conducted in a kindergarten classroom. And you can see that interviews was not the primary source of data collection. I really can't interview kindergarteners on how they learn because they're not very reflective on the learning process, what works well and what doesn't work well. And so I interviewed the teacher and a few parents, but most of the data from that particular study came from observations. In fact, I observed many school days watching kids learn in their natural settings. And then I collected a few artifacts such as lesson plans, but for that particular study, it was very observation heavy. In other studies that I've conducted, interviews tend to be, for example, very heavy in my data. And then I was able to use observations and artifacts to triangulate those findings to make sure that they're accurate. So this is why it's very important to try to have a variety of data sources so that when it's time to code your data and analyze your data is coming from different places and it's more reliable. Okay, so let's examine what are you trying to do when you collect all this data. So the goal of data collection and qualitative research is to gather evidence in order to describe and clarify the human experiences. Data is gathered through interviews, observations, and artifacts. And data is more credible when triangulated through the use of multiple data types. Okay. And so I want to wrap up by wishing you success in your data collection. And I hope that this presentation helps you get the best data possible for your study. Thank you.